Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest event in our series of virtual lectures and gallery talks around the exhibition Andrew Forge, The Limits of Sight. If you've attended or watched any of these virtual lectures in the past, I have mentioned that you can always catch up on our past events on our website, which is fairfield.edu/museum/Andrew Forge. And we are really excited to announce that as of yesterday, we have a beautiful 3D virtual tour of the exhibition using our brand new Matterport camera that we are very excited about. So if you are not able to see the exhibition in person, we encourage you to visit our website and get as close to the artworks as you possibly can in this new virtual world in which we are all living. And we are delighted to be co-sponsoring tonight's lecture by Dr. Jennifer Drake with the Psychology Department. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Chair and Associate Professor of the Psychology Department, Dr. Margaret McClure, who is also the Elizabeth DeCamp McInerney Chair in Health Sciences here at Fairfield. Margaret.
Thank you. Dr. Jennifer Drake is an Associate Professor of Psychology at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her research program focuses on the psychology of the arts. In one line of research, she examines the emotion regulation benefits of engaging in drawing for children and adults. In a second line of research, she studies the cognitive and perceptual processes underlying graphic representation skills in autistic, non-autistic, and gifted children. Her research has been funded by grants from the National Endowment of the Arts, the Imagination Institute, supported by the John Templeton Foundation, and PSC CUNY. Her research has also been featured in Scientific American Mind, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, The New York Times, and on National Public Radio. She was named a 2015 Rising Star by the Association for Psychological Science and an Outstanding Early Career Scholar in 2018 by the American Psychological Association for her work on the emotion regulation benefits of everyday art making. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Jennifer Drake.
Thank you, Margaret. And I want to thank first the Fairfield University Art Museum, as well as the Psychology Department for inviting me. Thank you all for attending. I'm excited to share my work on artistic giftedness. And in this talk, I'll show evidence that there are actually two trajectories or routes to artistic giftedness. The first being the early realism or representational route that's shown in this image by the 4-year-old of dinosaurs. And the second, the early abstraction route, as shown by the image by the 2-year-old, a very colorful and playful image. Now, I refer to children who are gifted in the ability to draw realistically as precocious realists. And this is a drawing by Joel, a precocious realist at age 7, where he drew a skeleton of a dinosaur. Now, individual differences in drawing can be found at a very young age, before children have the chance to end any training. This is a drawing by a typical 4-year-old. This is a drawing by a precocious realist, the same age, also age 4. So precocious realists are able to create lifelike representations that differ strikingly from those of the typical child. And in some cases, these child's drawings resemble those of adult artists. So this is a drawing by Arkin at age 4, which shows a very complex layering of dinosaurs. And this is something that he learned without any type of training. And then you have an adult drawing by Picasso, which also shows a layering of bulls. So in this talk, I will make 4 claims about precocious realists and giftedness in drawing. First, that these children are advanced from the start, demonstrating that this is not something that they're acquiring through practice or any type of training. This is something that is innate, that they're born with. Second, these children have superior spatial skills. In some ways, they are similar to autistic individuals, and in other ways, they're similar to adult artists. Third, these children have what's called a rage to master. That is an intrinsic drive or motivation to master their domain. And then finally, I will demonstrate there may be 2 routes to early giftedness, this early representational route, as well as this early abstraction route. So the first half of my talk will focus on the work I've done with precocious realists. And then the second half will focus on abstract arts and how we evaluate abstract art, particularly the work of abstract expressionist artists art prodigies, and the works of typical children. So first, these drawings by precocious realists are advanced from the start. And the early age of where you see these differences illustrates that this is not something that's acquired through taking art lessons or practice. This is something that children are born with and that is innate. So here we have an example of a Triceratops by Rocco, age 5. And perhaps the earliest sign of giftedness in drawing is the drawing of recognizable and differentiated shapes. So here we have a typical child drawing apples. So a typical child will draw slashes to represent objects. You don't know that it's an apple until the child has actually labeled the drawing. This is an apple. In contrast, a precocious realist, same age, is able to create the contour of the apple. So you can tell from the circle shape, it's an apple, it has a stem. Here's another example of two children age 3. So we have the typical child drawing of a person. This is called a tadpole drawing. It's a hallmark of children's drawings. It's where children are not able to draw both the body and the head of a person. They draw kind of this morphed body head with the arms and legs extending outward. And then Grace, in contrast to precocious realist, not only has she drawn the bodies of these two people, she's included an incredible amount of detail. So we have a necklace that the woman is wearing. Her hair is curly. If you look at the man, he has fingers. And you may even notice the playfulness in her drawing where the girl is like kicking a boot upward towards her dress. So these children's drawings, precocious realists, include an rich amount of detail. So this is an example of Rocco, age 5. This is a cave cricket. So these children are not creating, generic objects, or you can see here in this example, it's not a circle. He has very detailed in his shape and also the shading. So we're not seeing just a cave cricket that's black. We're seeing a cave cricket that is both black and shaded in gray and in different variations. Here's another example. This is Reese, age 5. Reese is from Malaysia and has drawn a temple. And then we also have an example several years later. So this is his drawing that in 9.5. He created this in 2 hours. He was inspired by the movie Kung Fu Panda. So this is a scene from that particular movie. So again, incredible amounts of detail. And here's another example by Arkin. I showed you his dinosaur drawing a few minutes ago. So this is at age 7. And so he's using drawing as a way to understand and study organic forms. And if you kind of to zoom in or kind of move a little bit closer to your computer screen, you would see that there's an incredible amount of detail. There's so many bones that he has drawn here to create the skeleton of this figure. There's teeth. And even if you look at the drawing on the top and look at the tongue, it's spotted in order to capture detail. Another technique that these children use is depth. They are using techniques to represent depth. So this is an example of occlusion. And I'm going to use my cursor so that you can see here. So occlusion is when you are drawing something in front of another. So you're partially occluding an object in order to represent depth. So this Triceratops dinosaur, the horn, the face, it's drawn in front of the T-Rex. Additionally, here, if you look at the legs, the front leg is in front of this, the front leg, I guess that would be on the left, is in front of the front leg on the right. Again, it's creating depth. It's almost as the Triceratops is charging forward past into the T-Rex. So occlusion is a technique that these children learn without having any type of lesson. They're discovering this on their own. Another technique is juxtaposition. So if you look at this tire here of this bicycle, the child has drawn both the top and the side of the bicycle, of the wheel. And this is again creating depth, and by a 2-year-old. Perspective is another characteristic of children's drawings that creates precocious realist, that creates depth. So we have drawings by at age 3 and 6. This is the same child who's able to draw linear perspective. The typical child doesn't master or even learn perspective, how to do it properly until the age of 13. So quite a difference. And then finally, another technique these children are using is foreshortening. So this is when you draw something compressed. So here, this cheerleader is, her torso is bent, looks like she's bending, it's compressed, she's bending over. And again, this is creating depth in her drawing. So these drawings are a lot of detail. They're showing things that are very different from what is found in the typical child. And one reason that these children have such precision in their drawing is that they may have superior spatial skills. And so what has been found is that these children have superior local processing abilities. And so local processing is when we're presented with a visual display, we focus on the details and we avoid the overall context or the whole. And this is particularly important when you're drawing. So not focusing on the whole avoids you to kind of create this simple schematic drawing. You can really hone in on the details and capture the drawing, the realism involved. And so what has been found is that autistic individuals have superior local processing abilities, and they excel in tasks that require them to find parts at the expense of looking at the whole. So 2 examples of autistic artists. This is drawing is by E.C. He's an autistic savant. And so he was studied by Motron and Bellevue. And what they found is not only is this incredible amount of detail in the drawing, but it was how he approached this drawing. So they filmed him while drawing and found that, typically what you see in an artist is they draw the overall shape, they would draw the overall sink and then add the details, and draw the bathtub, add the details. And what they found with EC is he drew part by part. So he kind of started at random places in this drawing. You never really knew what he was drawing until he was finished. So he wasn't drawing the overall design, he was drawing detail by detail. A similar finding was shown more recently by the artist Stephen Wilshire, who also has autism. So this is a skyline he drew of Manhattan. So he flew in a helicopter over Manhattan, and then this was his first time seeing the city. He came back to this art studio and drew this from memory. So there's an incredible amount of detail here. And what was found is he didn't draw the overall shapes of skyscrapers or buildings. Like EC, he drew part by part, detail by detail. So again, showing that local processing, that focus on details. And so a great deal of research has focused on this local processing on visual spatial abilities, with the most replicated being the block design task. So in this task, you are presented with a picture like this one here, and you're asked to copy it with a set of blocks. And so what I have here, these squares these are the various sides of the block. So a block has 6 sides, and these are the various sides of the block. So you have to be able to mentally segment this image. So instead of focusing on the overall shape, you have to focus detail by detail to see where one block would end and another would start. So it's quite difficult. When you present it in a segmented version, it's much easier to see where one block starts and the other begins. And it's much easier to complete and to copy. And what's been shown is that individuals with autism excel on this unsegmented version compared to non-autistic individuals. Another task where this local processing has been found is the group embedded figures test. So here participants are presented with a complex shape, like this one here, and asked to find a simple shape. And so here you have to avoid the context, the shading, the extra lines, and really focus on the details in order to trace that shape within that complex figure. And again, autistic individuals outperform non-autistic individuals on this task. And what I've shown in a series of studies is that precocious realists also have superior local processing abilities, and this seems to be related to their ability to draw realistically. So they outperform typical children on these tasks, the group embedded figures test and the block design task. And I've shown that this is unrelated to how old they are, their IQ, both nonverbal and verbal, or how many years of art lessons they have received. I've also found that this is independent of whether they have any autistic-like traits or an autism diagnosis. And then finally, I've shown that precocious realists, as well as drawing prodigies, outperform typical children on these tasks. So this work shows that local processing, superior local processing, is not exclusive to autistic individuals, but it's also found in precocious realists. And in work with colleagues at Brooklyn College and in London, I've shown that art students also have this superior local processing ability. not surprisingly. So when they're presented with a complex figure, they can find a simple shape much easier and much quicker than non-art students. And finally, I've shown that these children have personality and behavioral traits consistent with autistic individuals as well as adult artists. So precocious realists have elevated, restrictive, repetitive behaviors and interests. This is a sub-scale of the autism diagnosis. So this would include things like having an unusual memory, having unusual memory for details, being engaged in an activity for very long periods of time. I've also shown that these children are more open to experience, and this has also been reported in adult artists. So this would include things like having a vivid imagination, asking a lot of questions, being very curious. So these children have traits that are both in common with autistic individuals as well as adult artists. Third, I've shown, what has been shown is that these children have what's called a rage to master. So that is an intrinsic motivation or internal drive to master their domain. And this is what separates a gifted child from a prodigy. So a prodigy will engage in activity for long periods of time. They have to be pulled away from their chosen activity to even do things like eating or sleeping or going to school. And this rage to master has been found across different domains. It's not exclusive to visual arts. It's been found in music, math, and other academic areas. So here's an example of a precocious realist who created a drawing. He was at a dinner with his parents, and he used every surface he could to create a drawing. So using this placemat here. Here's another example. So this is by Aryan, age 2. And so he created this abstract drawing. And so Aryan, you can see in this little picture here, he uses Crayola markers, very meticulous about selecting which ones and where he wants to put them on the page. And he spent, his mom reported, several days working on this. And that is quite a lot of concentration for a 2-year-old to be able to spend that amount of much of time creating this artwork. And finally, there seems to be 2 routes of early giftedness. So I showed you evidence of precocious realism, as illustrated in this drawing by Arkin of the dinosaurs, this advanced ability that's been shown at a very young age. But there also seems to be emerging evidence that there might be this early abstraction route, where children are creating non-representational works of art. Now, the works of abstract expressionist artists like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Cy Twombly, have been likened to the work of typical children. And on the surface, these works do look superficially similar to the works of typical children. And one reason for that is it's very difficult to detect skill in abstract art. So when we evaluate representational art, a Van Gogh, a Wood, a Seurat, we can fall back on realism. We can compare these paintings, we can assess, well, does it accurately depict a Sunday on the park? Does it accurately depict a starry night? And so it's much easier to evaluate representational art where we can look at how realistic it is. Abstract art is much more difficult. The skill is not obvious. It is much more difficult to assess. And in some ways, that's why people like it less. They can't see the skill. They even think that it's a fraud because it's much more difficult to evaluate abstract art. And in some cases, we rely on context. So if we're viewing abstract art, we kind of rely on where, who made it? Is it in a museum? And if I presented you with these 3 images and asked you whether or not, do you think they're made by famous artists? Do you think they're good works of art? It may be difficult without knowing who made the works of art. And we may not know that this is by a Hoffman, a Pollock, or de Kooning, but these are by famous artists. So context does play a huge role. And in some cases, it plays a very large role. So let's take the work of Freddie Linsky. So this is the work that he created that was posted in an online gallery. And this is a caption, a review of the work. So the reviewer wrote, "The striking use of Oriental calligraphy has the kanji-like characteristics stampeding from the page, showing the new ascent of ease. It is one of Linsky's most experimental works." So based on this post and this work of art, he was invited to exhibit his work in Berlin. And this is Freddie Linsky. So his mom, who was an art critic, actually posted the painting and the description, the critique as a joke. And so you see Freddie here, he's creating the paints. I also like to note that he often likes to use ketchup and mustard in his works. So people were fooled, and the art community, art critics, were also fooled. Here's another example. So this is a painting that was exhibited in a London art museum. This is the artist, Congo. Again, this slipped into the museum without people knowing, so people were fooled. They didn't realize the difference. And so let's consider the role of context. I like this quote, it's from a senior curator at the National Gallery. So let's say I take one of our most abstract masterpieces, such as an Ellsworth Kelly, and I remove it from its frame and brought it to a restaurant. And this is an example of an Ellsworth Kelly on this slide here. It's a $5 million painting. I hang that Kelly on the wall with a price tag of $150. No one is going to notice it. An art curator might look up and say, "Hey, that looks like an Ellsworth Kelly. Please pass the salt." So again, the role of context, seeing this in an art museum versus in a diner or restaurant, really does make a difference in how we evaluate works of art. Now, even though people may think that abstract art is superficially similar to that of typical children and animals, we can indeed tell the difference. So a very clever set of studies was conducted by Snapper et al. And they showed participants pairs of images, one by a professional abstract expressionist artist, the other by a child or animal. And these works of art were matched on color, line, and composition. And they asked people which one is made by the artist. So now we've entered the audience participation portion of our talk. Normally, if we were in person, I would ask you to guess by raising your hand. So what I'd like you to do is just kind of note, maybe on a piece of paper, a scrap piece of paper, which one you think is by the artist. So the image on the left or the image on the right. And so I'm going to show you 4 pairs. In the real study, in the actual study, they showed participants 30 pairs. And I am going to tell you, I'm going to reveal which one is by the animal child versus the artist. That's not how they did it in the study. People were unaware. They weren't presented with any labels. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so hopefully you've locked in your answers. So the child is on the left. The artist, Hans Hofmann, is on the right. So I'm going to show these pretty quickly. So just jot down which one you think. So here's our next pair. Okay, so the elephant is on the left. Sam Francis, is the artist, is on the right. Okay, here we go. Next pair. All right, I'm going to reveal the answers. So here we have the chimp on the left, Cy Twombly on the right. And then our final pair. Okay, I'm revealing the answers. So the artist is on the left and elephant is on the right. So you can kind of see how you did out of 4, 3 out of 4, or 2 out of 4, maybe 4 out of 4. So what they found in this study is on average, people selected the artist 63% of the time. So they were able to identify the professional artist. Now, the key here was whether or not people were performing better than chance. If they're performing at chance at 50%, they're kind of just picking randomly. And so this 63% is significantly different from 50%. If you were in one of my classes, it's a passing grade, but not necessarily an A work here. So people are pretty good, but they're not amazing. They're not getting perfect scores here. And as you were looking at these pairs, you may have thought, well, you may have done a comparison, comparing the two to see if you could identify the more skilled individual, the artist. So in a subsequent study, they actually presented single images and asked people to identify which one was the child and which one was the they asked people to identify, excuse me, which one was by the artist. So I'm going to show you single images, 4 of them. So just take note which one you think is by the artist. This is the first image, the second, the third, and the fourth. Okay, so hopefully you jotted down your responses. So the first and the fourth were by the artist. The second and the third were by the child. And so what they found is that even when people were presented single images, they didn't have a comparison, they were able to select the artist 61% of the time. So very similar to that 63%. And in a subsequent study, they looked at what factors we use to evaluate work. So are we looking at things like intentionality or structure in the work? Are we using the use of negative space or metaphorical meaning? And what they found is that works by artists were rated higher in intentionality and in structure. And if you go back to the work by the child and the artist Hans Hofmann, and you look at these, you may see the structure and intentionality in Hans Hofmann's work. And you may notice the deliberate use of line, the clarity in which he's expressing different colors or drawing different, painting different lines here. So again, the work by artists was rated higher in structure and intentionality than the work by children and animals. Now, they concluded that people really see more than they think when looking at non-representational works. So you may think, oh, my child could paint that, or I could do that, but not really. You know, people can tell the difference. Even though superficially these works may look the same, people can tell which one is made by the artist and which one is not. Now, there are works or children that have been identified by their parents and agents as abstract art prodigies. And I'm going to show you a couple examples. So this is a work by Dante Lam. He is the youngest professional artist. He is a Guinness World Record holder for that. He began painting at age 2 and sold his first painting at age 3. Another example is Marla Olmsted. This is a picture of her at 4. These are also works that she completed at 4 years old. So she was the subject of a documentary that came out about a decade ago. My child could paint that. And she's also had exhibits of her work. Some more recent examples. So this is Alida Andre. She's Australian. This is her at age 7. So a couple years back, she had an art exhibit in Chelsea, which is a section of Manhattan. And so she sold some of her paintings for up to $50,000 a piece. And then more recently, we have Mikhail Akar. So this is an 8-year-old from Germany. And so he also has had exhibits for his works in Germany. And he, according to his Instagram, is the youngest abstract artist. So knowing this, knowing that the usual sign of giftedness is the ability to draw realistically, it is surprising to come across these abstract art prodigies. And if you follow these precocious realists, so here we have Arkin at age 4 and a drawing that he made at age 11. These precocious realists continue to draw hyper-realistically as they age. And if you were to really focus in on this, if we were kind of blow up this alien drawing, you'd see there's an incredible amount of detail in there, and shading and different shapes that he's created. And finally, if we look at the works of professional artists, they also drew realistically as children. So this is a work by Paul Klee, and this is one of his drawings at age 5. So he would have been identified as a precocious realist, hyper-realistic. You know, he drew very realistically, and then he became an abstract artist. Also is the case with Picasso. So this is one of Picasso's work on the left. This is a drawing that he made, a painting at age 9. Again, hyper-realistic. And here's a work by Picasso at age 12. And Picasso, when talking about a work of children's art, he said, I've never done children's drawings, never. It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. So again, given this, that we know the early sign of giftedness is the ability to draw realistically, that children who are identified as gifted at a very young age continue to draw realistically as they age, that adult artists who are drawing or creating abstract art drew realistically as children, it is surprising to come across these abstract art prodigies. So I was interested with my thesis student whether we can tell the difference. Is the work made by abstract art prodigies more like the work of typical children, or is it like the work of adult artists? And so I'm just going to go over kind of the study design, and I'm going to show you some images for this study. So we identified abstract art prodigies that were written up in the popular press and who had a professional website. So these are like the Marla Olmsteds and Lita Andres, Dante Lamont. So these are children who had been written up for their abilities, had a professional website. Many of them were also selling their artwork through their websites. And we, like the Snapper et al. Paper, we also matched, so we pulled images from their websites and we matched them with the Snapper et al. Images on either color, line, or composition. So we had 2 of the 3 factors, we matched them up. And this resulted in 3 sets of images with 10 pairs. So we had an artist-child pair, prodigy child, and artist prodigy. And I'm going to show you some examples. Again, I'm going to have you guess. So just kind of at home, make note of which ones you think are by which person. So we hypothesized that in the case when you're presented with the artist-child pairs, similar to the work that had been previously done by Snapper, those clever studies, that the artist would be correctly identified. People could tell the difference between a work by a master and a work by a typical child. We hypothesized that in the case of the prodigy child pairs, there would be no difference. They would be undistinguishable. People really couldn't tell the difference between the 2. They would be a chance. And we also hypothesized that when you were presented with the artist-prodigy pairs, the artist would be correctly identified. So like the artist child, it would be very clear which one was by the professional artist and which one was by the abstract art prodigy. Okay, so we presented them as pairs. So one of these is by, so we told participants in our study, you're going to view images, one's by an artist, one's by a child. So just make note which one you think is the artist. And I'll reveal the answers. So this, the one on the left is by the artist. Okay, next set of pairs. So this is the prodigy child pair. So we told participants that you're going to be viewing some images by prodigies, abstract art prodigies. We defined what a prodigy was, and by children, typical children. And we asked them to identify which one is by the prodigy. So take a moment to record your answers. And so the one on the left is the child, the one on the right is the prodigy. And then finally, we presented pairs that were by an artist or a prodigy. And we let the participants know that. We defined what a prodigy was. So which one do you think is by the artist? And so the artist is on the left, the prodigy is on the right. Okay, what did we find? So along the x-axis here, you're going to see the different pairs of images: artist child, prodigy, artist prodigy. And we're going to look at percentages here. Okay, so correctly identified the more skilled individual. Okay, so that in the artist child, this would be pairs, this would be the artist. Okay, and you might see that black line. So that's indicating 50%. That's chance. So we want to know, are people above the line? Are they able to identify the more skilled individual? So in the case of the artist-child pairs, we found that people were, in fact, able to identify the artist, replicating the work that had been previously done by Snapper and colleagues. And so if you look, it's a little under 70%. So people were pretty good at identifying the artist. Now, in the prodigy-child pairs, what we found, and contrary to our hypothesis, they sensed a difference. They could tell a difference. They were able to identify the prodigy. Not what we hypothesized. We hypothesized that they would be kind of treated the same or viewed the same. We actually found the prodigy was viewed people were able to correctly identify the prodigy. And then finally, in the artist-prodigy pairs, we found, contrary to what we hypothesized as well, as people really couldn't tell the difference, okay? They couldn't tell the difference between work by an artist and work by an abstract art prodigy. Now, it's possible that, we kind of are cluing people into, okay, you're looking at images by a prodigy. And so maybe that kind of influenced how people were reacting or how they were evaluating the works and identifying them. So in a subsequent study, we presented all of the images and we told them, okay, you're looking at images either by an artist or a child. Which one do you think is by the artist? Okay, and so this allowed us to see whether or not people would, if they were presented with the prodigy images, would they label it as an artist or would they think it was by a child? So again, we're looking at the 50% mark here is marked in black. And I have on the side, you'll see child at 0% and artist at 100%. So if they're above the line, you're seeing the bars. If the bar is above the line, that means participants were more likely to classify the image as by an artist. If it's below the line, they're more likely to classify it by a child. Okay, so for the artist, not surprisingly, they identify the artist as by an artist. Maybe not surprising as well, they're able to identify the child as by the child. And these stars are indicating how significantly different it was from chance. So in both cases, it was significantly different from 50%. Now, in the case of the prodigies, not what we thought, but people were more likely to identify the prodigies as being an artist than as a typical child. So what seems to be happening is that first we replicated the work of Snapper et al. So people can tell the difference between work, even though we think my child could paint that or I could do that. You didn't, right? We didn't create those works. And so people can tell the difference between works by abstract expressionist artists and that of typical children. And what we did find in the case of these abstract art prodigies, they're being classified as by an artist rather than a typical children. So they're seen as being similar to those masters rather than to the work of typical children. So there seems to be two routes to early giftedness, this early representational realism route and this early abstraction route. And as more abstract art prodigies emerge, it'll be important and interesting to include their images to see whether or not these findings are generalizable to other abstract art prodigies. Now, I am following these precocious realists to see how they develop, how their drawings may change. Do they continue to draw hyperrealistically? Do they go into fields that require this local processing? Do they become artists themselves? So this is a drawing I showed you earlier of Rocco, age 5, and this is Rocco at age 10. So he's very into political cartoons. So that's what he's been drawing lately. This is the work of Grace, age 3, and this is the work that she created at age 16. She's now 18 in college, and so she's a social activist and is using her art to get the word out on voting or Black Lives Matter. So she's continuing to draw, but using it for social activism. But we can also follow these abstract art prodigies. So this was Marla at age 4, and this is Marla now at age 15. So this is her at 15 and one of the works that she created recently. So we can see how do these children continue to develop in their works. This is Alita. So this is Alita at age 7. Alita is now 13, so this is the work that she created at age 13. So we can see how their process and how their work has changed as they age. So in conclusion, we can draw a couple points from this talk. First, that giftedness in drawing is a result of inborn talent. The early age at which these children are showing giftedness in drawing suggests that this is not due to training or practice. This is something that they have, this is innate, they're born with this ability. Second, these precocious realists, they have superior spatial skills and they share traits with individuals with autism. So they have those particular spatial skills in common with individuals with autism, their repetitive behaviors and interests, but they also share personality traits with adult artists like openness to experience. This extreme talent is related to a rage to master, an internal drive or intrinsic motivation to master a domain. And finally, there will be two routes of gifted child artists, potential routes, early realism and early abstraction. And I hope to, in the future, have more about that as my work moves forward. So I want to thank you for your attention. I also want to thank Brooklyn College and my lab, the Arts and Development Lab. And thank you for all tuning in. So I'm happy to answer your questions at this point.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. That was extraordinary. We do have some questions coming in the chat, and I'll remind people they can send their questions even as you are starting to answer them. Of course, since I'm asking you the questions, I'm going to cheat and bump mine to the front of the line. And that is, I was amazed to see that you've already started following these gifted children for 10 years or more, which is really cool. And I wondered, though, like what impact may or it may not have on them, especially the ones, they've been identified as a prodigy in abstract art. And they know that that's what they've been identified as, and they know they're the object of study and that people are impressed by them. And I'm just wondering, does that play a role in shaping what they're going to do, or they feel that they kind of have to keep proving themselves as a prodigy? Is that something you guys think about?
I think that's an excellent question. And there are some cases where children have been identified in academics or even music. They have been identified as prodigies and been pushed by parents, and that has kind of discouraged them from pursuing the arts or pursuing academics. A lot of these children, though, they do have that rage to master, so that internal drive, motivation. So they're less motivated by having like external attention or praise, and they're really motivated by having the ability to engage in the activity. That being said, parents do ask me, how do I nurture my child's gift? And I always say, like, don't push. And in some cases, they at a very young age they start drawing. But around 7 or 8, sometimes they lose, they lose interest for a little bit as they become more engaged with friends or in school or other activities. And I always tell parents, like, don't worry, they may come back to it, they may not, but just don't push, because we don't want to ever feel like they have to do something.
That's a great answer. So we have she didn't give her name, but a PhD student asked if you would be willing to share some of your sources. So if there's some major elements of further reading, obviously you've generously put your email address there on the screen, so this person might be able to reach out to you directly, but is there anything top of mind that you would recommend someone read if they're interested in this topic?
Yeah, so I would say, if you Google me, you can be linked to my website. And so on there I have links to articles. So if you're interested in anything that I presented here, please feel free to visit my website and download those articles. I would say in terms of gifted children, Ellen Winter has wrote a wonderful book on all giftedness, myth, and reality. So I definitely would recommend that book. Anything by Constance Milbreath. She's also done some work on gifted child artists. And that would be Richard Jolie has done stuff. He's in the UK. He's written several books about children and pictures. And so he would be a really good person to look him up as well. But for that person, please feel free to contact me, and I can kind of direct you to different people that you should be looking for to read more about this.
So we have a question from Jamie, and Jamie says, I'm guessing that the reason past famous artists painted realistically as children is because that's what they were exposed to. There wasn't as much abstract art, right?
That is potentially, it could be a reason, but even today we find that many professional artists, they kind of learn realism first. They kind of master those techniques and being able to do that. And then as they've mastered drawing realistically, they kind of want to break free and kind of do something different, like Picasso. He for many years, he did, even as young adulthood, he did draw very realistically. And then he went into Cubism, where he wanted to break the rules. So it might be that what they're exposed to, but I also think that they feel they need to master and learn different techniques that will help them in their abstract art.
Yeah, Picasso is a great example. I like to show students a progression of his self-portraits, which start hyper-realistically, because that's how he was trained, and then move into Cubism and more abstract work. Mm-hmm. I think he has a quote about you need to know the rules before you can break them, which dovetails exactly.
I think that's a wonderful quote too. Yes, definitely.
We have a question from Susan who asks, what about artists and children with mental disorders like patients with schizophrenia, for example, which knowing that that's what Margaret works on is actually very apropos.
I don't know much about work with schizophrenic and art. I don't know if Margaret has anything to add.
I was not forcing Margaret to come on onto the microphone.
So I am not an expert in art therapy. I know it's often used as an adjunctive treatment to help improve people's recovery. I do think that there are certainly cases of people with schizophrenia who have really amazing talents, for example, in art, in artistic ability. So it'd be interesting. I think maybe Dr. Drake and I should collaborate on a study to see what we find.
And that wonderfully answered a question that was offered by Leslie, who first said that this talk was great and then said she would love to know what you think about art therapy. Did you have anything else to add, Jennifer, about art therapy?
No, I mean, this is one line of research, but my other line of research looks at the benefits of everyday art making for children and adults. So not necessarily art therapy, but I do look at how engagement in the arts can be beneficial for mood and well-being. So I do think it's very particularly important. And in that work, I have found that when children and adults use drawing to distract themselves, it improves their mood. Now, these are non-clinical populations, so these aren't children who are adults who are dealing with mental illness. But I do think that many of these children, they get much of the precocious realist, it's very enjoyable for them. They love to draw, they have that rage to master, they want to engage in it, it's fun for them. And so I do think it has a lot of positive benefits for them as well in terms of their mood and well-being.
Now, when you say everyday art making, I'm thinking of those adult coloring books, which became very popular a few years ago. Do you consider that related to, because it's not independent drawing, but is that along the same lines as what you study there?
I do think, and I know in art therapy, they often use coloring as a way for people to get comfortable with the medium. And, a lot of people are very critical of their drawing. So I know that coloring books can be very helpful in terms of getting people used to using colored pencils and then shifting to kind of drawing. I do think it's still something creative. It's maybe less so than drawing on your own, but it is, you're selecting a coloring book to have and you're using different colors. So I still think it's engaging in something creative.
Great. I'll throw in a little plug there that we have a coloring book on our website for Fairfield University students who need a little stress relief around midterm time. We have a request from Marcia for you to repeat exactly what is meant by the term rage to master.
Right. So this is rage to master. This is a term that was coined by Ellen Winter. And so it's a intrinsic motivation. So you think kind of rage, but it's really like an intrinsic motivation, a drive to want to engage in this behavior, drawing, to do it, to master, to be able to hone your craft. And it's something that we find with these children, their parents report they have to be pulled away to eat or do everyday activities because they just want to draw all the time. And I think Ariane is a great example. Having an almost 2-year-old and thinking about her coming to a drawing and doing that for several days in a row, I mean, that's a lot of attention and being engaged in that activity for a long period of time.
We have another question, I think from the same Jamie, who identifies themselves as a psychologist with personality experience, asking, did you look at any personality traits besides openness? Openness isn't the most robust construct. Yeah, so
we gave parents the Big 5 personality questionnaire to fill in on their child's neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness to experience, and I'm going to for extroversion. And we found that the prodigies scored higher in openness to experience. And I would say that's one study, so it would be very interesting to see whether this, could be found replicated this finding. But we do know that adult artists are more open to experience as well.
We have a question from Alyssa, I think going back to your other research area in everyday art making, asking, does listening or creating music have the same psychological effects as drawing or painting?
So I don't do music. I mean, I'm only doing drawing, but I do think that listening to music is beneficial, and also playing music. I think activities where you're doing something active, like playing music, may be more beneficial. No one's really actually studied this, but I think it would be more beneficial than listening to music. But I know during the pandemic, I've listened to a lot of music and found it very, very comforting. So I think that it does have benefits as well.
I think you've just identified a potential thesis topic for some enterprising student, right? Let's see, we have Kathy who says, I saw the documentary, My Child Could Paint That, and I thought it insinuated that one or both of the parents might have done some work on the pieces at night. Has that been disproven?
It hasn't been disproven. There was speculation in that, and I didn't bring it up in my talk, but there was speculation that Marla's dad was kind of directing her to engage and where to put the paint. Now I have looked up her website. She's now 20, and she does still have, she is still creating works. And so at 4 or 5, it did seem like I was insinuated, and the parents, it wasn't ever really clarified whether or not she had created them on their own, but she still is creating works, and she's selling them as well. Yeah.
Wow. We have a question from Amy who asks, do you cover the psychological benefits of art in a society? Which I guess is sort of a big picture question.
Oh, do I? I mean, I don't, but I do think that's very important. And I know that a lot of people are turning to arts and what's going on in our world right now. So I do think that's very important for people to express themselves, even getting the vote out. I know people are doing a lot of art and trying to engage people and making sure that you vote. I'm not sure if I answered her question, but I don't necessarily, but I know people who are looking at that, yes.
And I think we have time for one more question, which again, I'm going to give to myself because I'm here. And that is, you talked so wonderfully about the importance of context in how we evaluate art, whether it's representational or abstract. And I wondered, how do you approach an unfamiliar art object? You know, with all of your training, what leads you toward an art object?
I mean, when I'm looking at a work of art, I really like to kind of zoom in and see the paint and the strokes. I guess I can think of Van Gogh. I'm particularly drawn to him because you could just see the paint just globbing on there, and I just feel this connection to him and to the artist. And so I think I just overall look at what has been conveyed in the brush strokes. Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, I just want to thank you again so much for this wonderfully stimulating talk. Thank you to our wonderful audience for tuning in this evening, and we hope to see you again in our virtual environment soon. Take care.
Thank you.